mysteries and people's natural curiosity have been a part of the American culture since the very beginning. In fact, the first great American mystery started before the country even existed. So we're going to go over some of the more famous ones and then a few lesser known mysteries. This was part of our idea to come up with different programs to do for the 250th anniversary. So the first one we're going to do is the Lost Colony of Roanoke. So colonists left Portsmouth, England on April 26, 1587 to begin a new settlement in the New World. England and Spain were at war, and the New World was a major battleground. The colonists landed on an island in the Outer Banks off the coast of North Carolina called Roanoke. At the time, the whole area was considered Virginia, so people think Roanoke was in Virginia, but it was really in the Outer Banks. John White was chosen by Sir Walter Raleigh to lead the colony. Raleigh had been given the charter to the land in Roanoke by Queen Elizabeth I. White did not have strong leadership skills, but he had already been to the New World, and White was not a great artist, but he had brought back paintings of the new plants, animals, and people that he had witnessed in the New World. So he was kind of seen as an expert, and so he got the job. This is one of his illustrations. The colonists were selected by Raleigh and White with building a new self-sufficient community in mind. They chose 60 men from various walks of life, farmers, craftsmen, and the like, and they also chose about 20 women, including White's own pregnant daughter. The women would be expected to work in the fields and houses, and there were almost a dozen children who went along. The party also included 2 native men whom White hoped would help the colonists to establish friendly relations with the local natives. Earlier, colonists had had problems with bites, diseases, and killings, but White did not disclose this to Raleigh. He hoped the native men and soldiers already at the fort could help keep the new colonists safe. The journey at sea lasted a month and a half. The first stop, they stopped on several different islands. At Santa Cruz, some colonists ate green fruit, and their lips and tongues swelled badly. Other colonists drank from a pond of water so evil, they said, they fell very ill. Some who washed their faces in the same water had swollen eyes for almost a week after. For meat, they captured 5 huge tortoises. The plan was to rendezvous with the soldiers at Roanoke and then continue north to Chesapeake, where the land was fertile and the harbor was safer. White and 40 men planned to meet with the soldiers using a smaller boat, but the ship's captain refused to take the colonists any farther than Roanoke and just sent them all ashore. When White and his men arrived at the fort, they found it had been razed. Vines grew in the remains of the houses, and all that was left of the soldiers was one single skeleton. White told his followers to make the best of what they had, and they began repairing houses. On August 18, 1587, White's daughter Eleanor gave birth to the first English child born in America. Her name was Virginia Dare. The colonists started to worry as summer ended because no one knew they were on Roanoke Island, since they were expected to have moved on to Chesapeake, which was 50 miles north. They tried to decide if they should move to Chesapeake or send someone back to England to let Raleigh know the situation. White felt pressured to make the trip, even though he hated leaving his daughter and her newborn. He worked out a special code with the colonists. If they left the area, they were to carve their new destination on a tree and put a cross if there had been any trouble. 9 days after Virginia was born, White set sail for England in a storm because he was so desperate to get to England and back. White's plan to get to England quickly, get the necessary supplies, and get back to Roanoke. That was the plan. Unfortunately, he had a lot working against him, including war in the Spanish Armada. He was not able to leave for an extended period. After 6 months, he made an attempt, only to be attacked by Spanish ships, a Scottish boat, and a French ship. He was wounded in hand-to-hand combat twice, and all of the colonists' supplies were stolen. He was forced to return to England. Of course, all of this cost money, and it was March 20th, 1590, before Sir Raleigh could put together enough money to send more ships, so that was almost 3 years later. 5 months later, following more storms and fighting, the ships reached their destination. When they arrived at the fort, it was completely empty. Near the village, a tree bore a carving of 3 letters, C-R-O. On one of the palisade posts, the word Croatoan appeared. There was no cross to indicate trouble. Chests that had been buried for safekeeping lay overturned and ransacked, and the boat used by the colonists was gone. John White returned to England once again, and due to storms, politics, and money, he never set foot in the New World again. Other explorers continued to go to the New World, though. John Smith, who befriended Pocahontas, heard from two separate tribes that clothed men still lived in the area. Pocahontas' father admitted being part of an attack on the colonists, but Smith did not speak of this until 14 years after he returned to England. Another explorer heard rumors in 1610 of Indians whose slaves built them stone-walled houses. Other stories circulated about blonde, blue-eyed natives, but none of these stories were ever proven. There are theories about what happened. Theory number one is no survivors. This theory states the colonists were all killed by natives or Spanish explorers who wanted to colonize the same area. Theory number two is that they were absorbed by natives. Some people believe the colonists coexisted with the native people and eventually became part of the tribes by marrying into the group or being captured as slaves. Theory three is lost at sea. This theory has the colonists trying to sail to England in the small boat and getting lost at sea. And theory number four is split community. Some theorize the majority of the Roanoke colonists took the boat and continued on to Chesapeake as planned, but they left a small group at the fort. The smaller group eventually departed for Croatoan Island, which explains the carvings. Archaeologists recently uncovered significant evidence of cohabitation on Hatteras Island, which was formerly, at the time it was known as Croatoan Island. They have found 16th century English items like slate writing tablets and a gold ring. As for Virginia Dare, she is the subject of a popular legend. The legend says that Virginia was raised by the Croatoan people. When she grew up, an old medicine man fancied her and wanted to marry her, but Virginia refused his offer. Outraged, the medicine man turned Virginia into a white deer. Even today, people claim to see a mysterious white deer in the forests of North Carolina.
For a child, that is the child.
Yeah, that was the child. Yep. Our next mystery, Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. We all know the rhyme, but what you may not have known is the numbers are a little off. Abby Borden received 18 blows and Andrew Borden received 10. The Borden case captured the public's fascination near the turn of the century, and it would not ever let go. The Borden family was a curious one. Andrew and Sarah Borden had two daughters, Emma and Elizabeth. Alice, a daughter born in between the sisters, would die before the age of 2. Emma was 9 and Elizabeth was only 2 when Sarah died. On her deathbed, Sarah asked Emma to look after baby Lizzie, a promise Emma took very seriously. Just before Lizzie's 5th birthday, Andrew remarried Abby Gray. The family lived in Fall Rivers, Massachusetts, about 50 miles south of Boston. Abby was the only mother Lizzie really knew, and Lizzie called her mother up until a few years before the murders, when she began calling her Mrs. Borden after family discord over a property dispute. Emma and Lizzie were angered that Andrew had signed over property to the Gray family, which was Abby's family. Andrew Borden was a self-made man who at the time of his murder was worth about $10 million in today's money. He was a shrewd businessman who built his success through several different industries. At the time, he started in furniture making and wound up president of a bank. At the time of the murders, he was bank president, and the family should have been at the peak of high society. But in Fall River, there was an important geographical distinction. The social elite lived in beautiful mansions with modern amenities in a neighborhood called The Hill. Andrew insisted on living in the lower part of the town known as the Flat. Their house on 2nd Street, and this is a picture of it, lacked indoor toilets and bathtubs and was rather cramped. This was a huge source of embarrassment to the sisters. Can you imagine your father has millions of dollars and won't give you indoor plumbing? So they were not happy. Both sisters would have been classified as old maids because Andrew was tight-fisted and not particularly pleasant, and Abby was from a lower social class. The family was largely avoided socially, even though they were respected for their money. This dynamic of having millions of dollars while living in a house without a bathroom has been cited as a main reason for the family's ultimate downfall. Emma was a powerful force in Lizzie's world. She was viewed as the more dominant sister, and some theorize Emma and Lizzie may have conspired, with Emma masterminding the murders and Lizzie committing the act. Lizzie may have been motivated to protect Emma's inheritance as much as her own. Emma's relationship relationship with Abby was always more sour because Emma had stronger recollections and loyalty to Sarah. Emma may have used that property issue as a way to turn Lizzie against Abby, because up until that point, everybody said Lizzie really didn't have any issues with Abby. When the murders occurred, Emma was 41 and was away on a trip visiting friends and giving herself a solid alibi. Historians have debated Lizzie's motive for over a century now. Some consider the most logical motive to be financial gain. After her father transferred property to Abby's family, they feared their stepmother would eventually inherit the majority of Andrew's wealth and leave them with nothing. Another theory is Lizzie could have been motivated by emotional or physical abuse. Shortly before the murders, for example, Andrew took an axe to Lizzie's pet pigeons, which she kept in the barn, because he said they were attracting local boys. Some psychologists say this may have been the breaking point for Lizzie. During the trial, it was suggested that Lizzie may have suffered from fainting spells or absences. Nowadays, neurologists have thought she may have suffered from temporal lobe epilepsy and entered a fugue state when she could have performed the violent act without full consciousness and therefore no memory. This theory would explain her calmness afterward. Another good theory is the social outcast theory. Lizzie was 32, unmarried, and trapped in her father's house. Back then, an old maid like Lizzie would have had very little independence or choices. Killing her father was the only way to gain financial freedom to live the life she felt she deserved. Lizzie was acquitted in 1893 of murdering her father and stepmother. However, that case may have turned out a lot differently were Lizzie tried today. One of the primary reasons Lizzie was acquitted was because the all-male jury bought her team's legal defense argument that it was not possible for such a well-bred Sunday school teacher to commit such a gruesome act. The men on the jury could not buy the idea that a member of the weaker sex could hack up her parents, clean up the blood, and appear calm within minutes of the crime. Some believed Lizzie had made an earlier attempt at murder when the entire Borden household became violently ill in the days leading up to the murder. Abby even went to the doctor fearing she was being poisoned. Now, many historians believe the more obvious answer to the illness was that the family had been eating the same leftover, unrefrigerated mutton soup for nearly a week in August. So that was probably pretty rank at that point. Adding credence to the poisoning idea, though, is that the prosecution uncovered evidence of Lizzie's attempt to buy prussic acid, which was a form of cyanide, from the neighborhood drugstore. Lizzie claimed it was for cleaning a sealskin cape. Although the acid was used to protect expensive furs and other garments in storage, this usually was done by a furrier who had specialized equipment because it was so dangerous to handle. In Lizzie's case, the druggist refused to sell her the acid because it was such a deadly poison that he would only sell it with a physician's prescription. But the judge excluded all of the prussic acid evidence from the trial because it was prejudicial and not directly relevant to the crimes that had been committed. Evidence that was related to the crime, though, was Lizzie burning a dress. A few days after the murders, Lizzie was seen by a witness burning a blue dress. When caught, she claimed she was destroying it because it was stained with brown paint. The prosecution argued it was actually the blood-stained dress that she wore during the killings. Other evidence presented included a forensic first. The Borden case was one of the first cases in the U.S. to use blood-stain pattern analysis. Although rudimentary compared to the resources law enforcement can use today, the prosecution argued the lack of blood on Lizzie was evidence of a calculated cleanup, while the defense argued the same fact showed her innocence. After the verdict was read and Lizzie was freed, she decided to stay in Fall River. She used her inheritance to buy a Victorian mansion that she named Maplecroft, and she changed her name to Lizbeth. She'd finally made it to the hill, and that's her house, which I believe you can stay in. I think it's a bed and breakfast now. Emma moved in with her, and she continued to live in luxury for the rest of her life, but she was a social pariah. When she went to church, people would get up and move away from her. After 13 years, she even had a falling out with Emma, who was rumored to have disapproved of Lizzie's scandalous friendship with an actress, Nance O'Neill. Lizzie had become a fan of the theater and began hosting lavish parties for O'Neill and other actors at Maplecroft. and a 1905 party was the final straw and led to a massive argument between the sisters. The rift was permanent. They never reconciled, not even when Lizzie was dying of complications from gallbladder surgery in 1927. Emma never called or visited. Interestingly, Emma died only 9 days later of chronic nephritis. They are buried together in the family plot alongside the father and stepmother they are accused of killing. Lizzie never married or had any children and eventually left much of her fortune to the Animal Rescue League. Our next mystery takes us to Appalachia in the 1940s, Fayetteville, West Virginia, and Christmas 1945. George Sauter, an Italian immigrant, owned a successful trucking business and was known for speaking his mind. He shared his thoughts on many subjects, but especially his criticism of Benito Mussolini, talk that many in his immigrant community of the era did not appreciate, which is kind of odd, but they were still fans of Mussolini. George and his wife lived in a 2-story house with their 10 children. John, Joe, and that's their ages. Joe, who was serving in the military in World War II at the time, so he was not home. Marion, George Jr., Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny Irene, Betty, and Sylvia. They were a close-knit family who worked long hours together and were very loyal to each other. They were regarded as a respected middle-class family. Leading up to Christmas Eve, the family experienced several odd encounters. In October, a life insurance salesman visited the home. After being turned away without a sale, he warned George that his house would, quote, go up in smoke and your children are going to be destroyed because of the dirty remarks you've been making about Mussolini. Another visitor to the house said he was seeking work and used the opportunity to go around the back of the house, and he warned George that a pair of fuse boxes would cause a fire someday. George did not understand why the man would say this, since the house had been rewired recently with a new electric stove was being installed, so they had to upgrade the electric. Just a few weeks before Christmas, George's older sons had noticed a strange car parked along the main highway through town. The occupants of this vehicle were watching the younger Sauter children as they returned from school. The family spent Christmas Eve together before George and the oldest 2 boys went to bed, tired after a busy day of work. The younger girls asked if they could stay up later because Marion, who had been working at the dime store, had given them toys for Christmas. Their mother let them stay up on the condition Maurice and Louis did their chores and cared for the cows and chickens before turning in themselves. Then Jenny took Sylvia and went to bed. Jenny answered a strange telephone call right around midnight from a woman who asked her, she asked for the name of someone who didn't live there. She could hear laughter and clinking of glasses. When she told the woman she had the wrong number, the woman gave Jenny a weird laugh and hung up. When she got off the phone, she noticed Marion had fallen asleep in the living room and the other children were not around. Jenny assumed they had gone to bed, but they had neglected to draw the curtains, shut off the lights, or lock the doors like they normally would do if they stayed up later than their parents. Jenny did those tasks and then returned to bed. Around 1 a.m., Jenny was awakened by a loud noise on the roof, followed by a rolling sound. She searched the house and found nothing amiss and went back to bed. Less than an hour later, she awoke again to smoke and flames spreading through the lower level. Panic ensued. The parents grabbed little Sylvia from her crib in their room and ran outside. There they found John, Marion, and George Jr. had escaped, but not Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, Irene, or Betty. George tried to rescue the other children. He smashed a window with his bare arm, but was forced back by the fire repeatedly. His trucks, which were parked nearby, failed to start when they tried to move them to reach the upper windows. Within minutes, the roof collapsed. The fire would burn until dawn. The home was a complete loss. Marion had run to a neighbor's house to call the fire department, but she wasn't able to get an operator to respond. A neighbor who saw the fire tried to call from a nearby tavern. When he also couldn't get a response, he drove into town and hunted down the fire chief, F.J. Morris. The chief initiated the phone tree system, which was used to contact the other firefighters. Although the firehouse was only 2.5 miles away, firefighters would not respond until 8 a.m. Back then, the firemen were volunteers and they had little equipment. The Sauters expected to find their missing children in the wreckage of the fire, yet after a cursory search, no human remains were found. The chief thought the fire may have been hot enough to cremate the bodies. He told George to leave the site undisturbed and a state fire marshal will perform a more thorough investigation. After 4 days, no one from the state had come, so George, unable to stand looking at the ruins, bulldozed to cover the site. At the beginning of 1946, the coroner's office issued 5 death certificates. The coroner convened an inquest the week of the fire. Among the jurors was the salesman who had threatened George that his house would burn down. The inquest determined the fire was caused by faulty wiring. At this point, the remaining family members had their doubts that the children had died in the fire. Marion said she watched the upstairs windows looking for any signs of the children, and she never saw any of them, nor did she smell any burning flesh. Neighbors reported seeing a stranger around the property that night, even though it was a remote area where strangers generally didn't roam. The determination of faulty wiring made little sense since they had the house's wiring updated and inspected recently, and the Christmas lights remained lit during the blaze. That night, a ladder had been missing from its place by the side of the house. It was later found in a ditch down the road. A telephone repairman told the Sodders the phone lines had been cut rather than burned. Why had the trucks not started? Had they been tampered with, or did George and his sons accidentally flood the engines in their haste? The driver of the bus that passed through Fayetteville on Christmas Eve said he saw some people throwing balls of fire at the house. When the snow had melted, little Sylvia found a small, hard, dark green, ball-like object in the brush nearby. George thought it looked like an incendiary device and remembered his wife hearing the loud thump before the fire. The family claimed the fire had started on the roof, although there was no way to prove it. Jenny began experimenting. She would burn small piles of animal bones to see if the bones would burn away completely, and none of them ever did. She spoke with someone at a crematorium who told her bone fragments remain even after bodies are burned at 2,000 degrees for 2 hours, which is hotter and longer than the house fire burned. Then the sightings of the children started. Some people claim to have spotted some or all of the children at various locations around the country. The Sodders hired C.C. Tinsley, a private investigator, who learned of a rumor that Chief Morris had found a heart in the ashes. He packed it into a metal box and buried it. When the chief was confronted, he showed them where he had buried it. The Sodders took the box to the funeral home director, who determined it was a beef liver which had been untouched by fire. The chief had buried it, hoping that they would find it and then let it go, but they did not. The Sodders sought help from the FBI. J. Edgar Hoover responded that although he would like to help, jurisdiction lay with the local authorities, and they would have to invite the FBI to participate. The local authorities declined. Despite the official investigation being closed, the Sodder family did not give up hope. They had flyers printed up, like this one here, with pictures of the children offering a $5,000 reward, which soon was doubled for information that would have resolved the case for even one child. In 1952, they put up a billboard at the site of the house with the same information. It would become a landmark for traffic through Fayetteville, and George would continue to follow up any leads that came in throughout the years until his death in 1969. Anytime, like, the actual police had closed the case, wouldn't investigate anything, so anytime a tip came in, he would go to wherever it was. He drove to New York, he drove to Texas, he went wherever somebody said they might have seen one of these kids. For the rest of her life, Jenny wore black in mourning, and she stayed in the family home and tended the flower garden that was planted over the site of the original home. After her death in 1989, the family finally took down the weathered billboard. Her surviving children continued to seek answers, with the exception of John, who felt his siblings had perished in the fire and the family would be better off to move on. This is Sylvia, the youngest one, who was only 2 at the time of the fire. One theory is that the Sicilian Mafia was involved. They were rumored to be active in the area and would not have taken kindly to George's outspokenness regarding Mussolini, and some thought the Sodders could have been caught up in something which they were not even aware. The surviving siblings later theorized that perhaps the Mafia tried to recruit or extort George, which could have resulted in retaliation with his refusal because their father would have never gone along with that. And the remaining family today are aware the story will likely never find resolution. Had any of you heard of that one? The next one is the disappearance of Marjorie West. Marjorie West or the
No,
Saunders?
the other one. I don't remember when or when, but I remember that story.
How many people think the kids lived through the fire?
I think they weren't in the fire.
Okay, so the disappearance of Marjorie West. On Mother's Day, May 8th, 1938, the West family of Bradford, Pennsylvania started the day off at church. The father, Shirley, was an assistant engineer at Kendall Refining, one of the region's largest employers. The family also included Mother Cecilia and children Dorothea, who was 11, and Alan, 7, and then little Marjorie, who was 4. After church, the family drove 13 miles to a clearing in the Allegheny Forest. The area was popular with hunters and fishermen. Family friends, the Ackerlands, joined them for a picnic. Around 3 p.m., Cecilia headed back to the road to take a rest in her car. Her husband prepared to go trout fishing with Mr. Ackerland. The girls wanted to pick wildflowers. Their father warned them to watch out for rattlesnakes, and the girls began gathering violets. After a while, Dorothea headed to the car to deliver their bouquet to their mother. When she turned around, her sister had disappeared. After a search for Marjorie failed to find her, the family had to drive to the nearest phone, which was 7 miles away, to call the police for help. The search that ensued lasted for months and involved more than 3,000 locals actively searching, while countless others followed the national newspaper coverage. When the police failed to find Marjorie that Sunday afternoon, they called in 200 additional men from the Moose and Elk Lodges and the Citizens Conservation Corps. A paper at the time noted, all available flashlights in the city were pressed into service. The effort was hampered by a 1 a.m. rain. On Monday, word had spread and the search party grew to 500. Police interviewed motorists across 300 square miles. Tuesday brought bloodhounds from New York. Tuesday evening, they found some clues. According to Marjorie's descendants, the dogs followed her scent to the road alongside the clearing. They also found a crushed bouquet of violets. Many believed Marjorie was picked up by the road. Witnesses reported 3 cars that had passed through the area around 3 p.m. 2 of the drivers were identified fairly quickly. The third, a man, was seen fleeing in a Plymouth so fast an oncoming motorist had to pull into a ditch. On Wednesday afternoon, the mayor requested 1,000 volunteers. The response, 2,500. The search was very well organized by men who had served in World War I. Surveyors mapped out the land and the men stood shoulder to shoulder. The ladies served 1,600 cups of coffee. By the end of the week, the search had covered 35 square miles. Engineers pumped out a muddy well, and Native Americans joined the search tracking she-bears, which were the mother bears that were prone to carrying off small children. And Shirley did not leave the forest for a week, and then he only left to eat dinner with his family and returned. Since this was during the Depression, another danger for Marjorie would have been kidnappings for profit. The criminal element would snatch children and ask for a ransom as a way to make a quick buck. Yet some believed Marjorie could have been kidnapped for a different money-making proposition. This was during the time when George Tann, the executive director of the Memphis branch of the Tennessee Children's Home Society, was in operation. Tann would acquire children using questionable methods, like tricking poor couples into giving up their children, and then she sold the children to wealthy clients who were unaware of her methods. Could Marjorie have been grabbed only to be sold? The state police investigation continued off and on for 6 years. Shirley and Cecilia West separated in 1953. Family members say Marjorie's closest relatives went to their graves believing she was alive. Those involved in the search said the child could not have been in the woods given how hard the great number of men searched. Dorothea's granddaughter said, I remember listening to my grandmother tell me stories about Marjorie and the sadness she felt for leaving her sister alone for those few moments. My grandmother held on to her feelings of responsibility until her passing. Around 1998, when the internet access became more widespread, Harold Beck, a writer and a college professor, began investigating the case. He posted a $10,000 reward for information about Marjorie and also posted up-to-date photos of Dorothea. So that's Dorothea in the second picture, because he assumed Marjorie would resemble her. Beck received several tips about a nurse in Florida who looked like Dorothea. The nurse denied being Marjorie. In 2005, he heard from the nurse again. By then, she had returned to her childhood farm in North Carolina. Beck said she told him a story the nurse had learned from her mother on her deathbed. In 1938, the nurse's father left the farm and drove north to work in Bradford's refineries over winter. He was driving home to the farm on Mother's Day when he hit a little girl with his car. He didn't see anyone around with her, so he scooped her up to rush her to the hospital, afraid she was either dead or dying. En route, the little girl woke up and acted as if she were fine. He and his wife had just lost their only daughter months earlier. Her delivery had been difficult, and they were told not to expect any more children. The man brought the child to the farm and presented her to his wife. They raised her as their own. A few years later, he lost an arm in World War II and told his wife that it was God's way of punishing him for what he'd done. The nurse told Beck that she used to tell her parents she remembered another family and a place with snow over her head. Despite the doctor's belief, her parents went on to have 4 more children. Oh, that's what we're on. Parents went on to have 4 more children. Beck published his book, Finding Marjorie West, in 2010, but Marjorie's family is unconvinced. The nurse said she didn't want anyone to know her identity, so he never did reveal her identity, even though the lady has since died, so there's no way to prove whether she is or isn't, so the family is not, they think he may have just made the whole thing up, so. And for our next mystery, fans of the final season of Stranger Things may be familiar with Mr. Whatsit. In the show, he is a not-so-imaginary friend of Holly Wheeler, who is eventually revealed to be evil. The name was a nod to Mrs. Whatsit from A Wrinkle in Time. What you may not know is that the Duffer Brothers were rumored to have been inspired by a real-life story from 1962. According to the story, 37 kids reportedly never spoke to or met one another, yet they drew the same frightening figure and said it was their imaginary friend. The figure was a tall, faceless man with a top hat. Psychologists suggested it may have been a rare case of shared imagery when children exposed to similar stress or environments unknowingly created the same disturbing mental figure. Between 1960s and 1980s, America was full of serial killers like Ted Bundy, the Manson family, Son of Sam, Gacy, and many more. In the days before DNA, it was just easier to get away with murder. Forensics was not as advanced, and there was often interdepartmental fighting between law enforcement. The aforementioned serial killers were caught. One was not, and that was the Zodiac Killer. Active from 1968 to 74, he claimed he committed 37 murders, and then there was silence. However, they only confirmed, I think it was 5 murders. Our story begins on December 20th, 1968, in a small town in California near San Francisco. David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, 2 teenagers, parked in a secluded area on a date. A second car pulled up and shot into the car. The victims tried to run away, but both were shot and killed. Initially, it was thought to be drug-related because David, an Eagle Scout, had pushed back against an individual who was trying to deal in his town. Then, on July 4th, 1969, Darlene Farron, a 22-year-old local waitress, went for a drive with her friend, Mike McGow, in Vallejo, California. So Mike was, they referred to him as a friend, but he said he was her boyfriend. It turns out Darlene was actually married, but her husband wasn't concerned. He didn't think there was anything going on. And Darlene also had an ex-husband who had been, you know, like people said that he had stalked her and stuff like that. So this woman is 22 years old and has an ex-husband, a husband, and a boyfriend. So they believe, so while they were driving, they believed a police officer was approaching their car, but instead the man shot them. Darlene was killed, but Mike survived. Darlene had told some people that she was afraid of someone, but she didn't say who. In this situation, the killer seemed more focused on killing Darlene, so the police thought it was someone that she knew. Police focused on Darlene's ex-husband until a strange phone call came into the Vallejo Police Department. The caller said he wanted to report a double murder, described the car and type of gun used to commit the crime, and said he killed those kids last year too. On August 1st, 1969, the killer sent letters to 3 newspapers, including the San Francisco Chronicle. He called himself Zodiac. He gave details such as what clothing the victims were wearing to prove he was the killer. He warned the papers that if they did not print the letter, he would cruise around and kill a dozen people that weekend. The papers published his cipher that was included in the letter. Cryptographers and intelligence agencies, the CIA was involved, everybody got to work trying to decipher the code. A husband and wife who were teachers were the ones to solve the first code. She said she went through and she found the double letters and assumed the double letters was an L and worked back from there. On September 27th, 1969, in Napa, Cecilia Shepard and Brian Hartnell were in their early 20s, and they were by the waterfront, lying on the beach and talking. Cecilia spotted a man, and this was by a lake, not an ocean, so it's kind of a secluded area. She spotted a man, and she told Brian she saw somebody, and he said not to worry about it because there's a lot of other people picnicking probably, and don't be concerned. She kept watching the guy and couldn't focus on what Brian was saying to her because she was too distracted by what this guy was doing. And then the man walked behind a tree, about 200 feet from them. And he came out wearing something that looked like that, a medieval executioner's mask. He was upon them with a gun and a knife. He had Celia tie up Brian, and then he tied up her. And then he stabbed them. He didn't shoot them, he stabbed them. And a fisherman found them, and he went for help. He left them there. He didn't come on shore. He just drove, took the boat and went for help. Celia didn't make it. Brian did. He made it to the hospital. They were both alive at the time, and they got each other on time, but she didn't make it to the hospital. Park Ranger Dennis Land brought suspicion upon himself by packing up the entire crime scene and taking it back to the ranger station. He said he thought he was doing the right thing by getting evidence out of the elements and making sure nothing blew away. They did find a unique footprint. Once again, the Zodiac called his crime in to the police, and when he did that, Ranger Land was at the crime scene with the police, so this helped remove suspicion from him, but that was just dumb luck, because that was really stupid what he did. Turns out he really was just incompetent. And the victim's car had dates written on it referencing the other murders, so this guy knew what car they'd gotten out of. The reign of terror continued in San Francisco. On October 11th, 1969, he killed a taxi driver named Paul Stein in Presidio Heights. He'd gotten in the taxi, took a ride with the guy, and then killed him. And he sent letters taunting the police for not catching him yet. A couple days later, he sent a letter threatening to shoot out the tires on a school bus and then kill the children as they left the bus. So police cars would follow school buses on their routes, and the bus drivers were told not to stop if they got a flat tire. They were to instruct the children to get down if shots were fired and to just keep driving until they got to a safe location. He later threatened to blow up a school bus also. In another weird turn for this case, the lead investigator on the case was Detective Danny Toshi, one of San Francisco's most famous homicide investigators. He was the inspiration for the Dirty Harry movies. He was removed from the Zodiac case in 1978 after writing anonymous letters to the San Francisco Chronicle praising his own work and signing them Concerned Citizen. Around the same time, the Chronicle also received a new letter claiming to be from the Zodiac killer. Toshi was suspected of forging this letter in an effort to garner renewed interest in the case. Toshi was eventually cleared of wrongdoing in the Zodiac forgery, but the incident tarnished his reputation. He was removed from homicide and put on the pawn shop detail as his punishment. He remained on the force until his retirement in 1985. At some point, someone claiming to be Zodiac called into a television show for an interview, but Brian Hartnell said the voice was not Celia's killer. In 2021, amateur code breakers finally cracked one of the other ciphers. Unfortunately, there were not a lot of clues in the message, but he did deny being on that TV show in that message. One of the prime suspects was Arthur Lee Allen. Toshi said he was confident Allen was guilty. Allen lived in Vallejo near several murder sites. Among other odd circumstantial evidence, he owned a Zodiac brand wristwatch using the same crosshair symbol. He had a typewriter matching the kind used in the zodiac letters, and as a teacher, he was known to teach his students about ciphers and codes. He also was a convicted child molester and had been fired from multiple teaching jobs for inappropriate behavior. He may have seemed like a good suspect, but his fingerprints and handwriting did not match zodiac samples, and DNA from saliva on the stamps and envelopes did not match Allen's either. Ultimately, the evidence against him was only circumstantial. When the Golden State Killer was found and arrested using familial DNA, investigators had new hope they might be able to do something similar with this case, but so far that hasn't panned out. And we do have a book on how they caught the Golden State Killer, and I was gonna bring it up here, but it's checked out. In 2021, a group of independent cold case investigators called the Case Breakers, made up of retired FBI agents, military agents, and investigators, announced they had cracked the case. They named Gary Post, an Air Force veteran and house painter who died in 2018. They point to matching shoe sizes, facial features, a scar, and other evidence. They also found people who claimed he admitted to being Zodiac before he died in his 80s. They said his name really was hidden in the ciphers, but investigators misinterpreted it as Stamp instead of Post. A Sacramento attorney and his investigator had named Post as the killer years earlier, and after their own lengthy investigation, but despite this, the FBI's official position is the case remains open and unsolved. One theory is that the Zodiac killings were murders for hire, and the killer used the letters as a clever ruse to make police think they were serial killings and throw them off the trail of the murder for hire. You're waiting for this one? Our next story starts on June 14th, 1947. Mac Brazel, a rancher, and his son Vernon drove across their land about 80 miles northwest of Roswell, New Mexico. Brazel said they came upon a large area of bright wreckage made up of rubber strips, tinfoil, and other tough paper and sticks. The metallic lightweight fabric was scattered and shredded by gravel and brush. He didn't know where it came from or how it got on his property, so on July 4th, he collected as much of it as he could, and he took the mysterious pieces on July 7th and drove them to Roswell and gave it to Sheriff George Wilcox, who also had no idea what it was. The sheriff contacted Commander Blanchard of the Roswell Army Airfield, who passed him on to his supervisor, General Roger Ramey, the commander of the 8th Air Force in Fort Worth. Meanwhile, Blanchard sent Major Jesse Marcel, an intelligence officer from the Roswell base, to investigate. The sheriff, Marcel, and Brazel returned to the ranch and collected all of the wreckage. Even though they were still trying to determine what the materials were, Marcel made a public statement on July 8th. His statement appeared in the Roswell newspaper. Alongside the headline, RAAF captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell. The story announced that the military had come into possession of a flying saucer. The Air Force felt that the crashed alien spaceship was a better story to release to the public than telling the truth about Project Mogul. And what a choice that was. With that choice, Roswell got a tourism boost that still exists today. Project Mogul was a top-secret U.S. military program in the 1940s that used giant high-altitude balloons to detect Soviet nuclear tests. At the time, the U.S. did not know when the Soviets would come into possession of nuclear weapons, and government officials were terrified by the prospect. Project Mogul was a classified program in which the U.S. launched these massive balloons into the ionosphere to listen for Soviet atomic detonations using sensitive acoustic equipment. On July 9th, the War Department tried to backtrack and claim it was a weather balloon that had crash-landed in the field, but the idea of flying saucers had been put out there and it had captured the public's imagination. According to Roger Launius, retired curator of space history at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, UFO sightings are not unusual. He said they're simply unidentified things you see in the sky. We've all probably seen them, and if you look long enough, you'll probably eventually figure out what it is you're looking at. It's not extraterrestrials. By the end of 1947, more than 300 alleged flying saucer sightings were reported in the last 6 months alone. However, Launius said, not that there was ever any credible evidence to support the sightings. None of this information stopped the public's fascination with extraterrestrials, and before long, any government site, regardless of its purpose, was believed by many conspiracy theorists to house the remains of little green men. Just last Friday, the Pentagon released an unprecedented historic batch of files regarding Roswell, as well as other UFO sightings. The files covered dozens of sightings by military personnel and civilians that occurred in both the daytime and the nighttime, and some of these incidents have not been explained. Our last mystery this evening is the Springfield 3. It's June in Springfield, Missouri, 1992. Suzanne, Susie Streeter, and Stacy McCall are excited to be graduating high school. On the night of June 6th, after graduation, Stacy had asked her mother's permission to stay at her friend Janelle's house. Janelle's house was already full with family in town for graduation, so at 2 a.m., Stacy made the decision to go with Susie and stay at her house. Susie lived with her mother, Cheryl Levitt. Janelle told the girls she would meet them the next day to go to a Branson water park. Starting at 8 a.m., both Janelle and Mrs. McCall began calling Cheryl Levitt, called her house trying to reach Stacy. They got no answer, and eventually Janelle and her boyfriend headed to the house to look for them. They arrived to find all 3 cars on the property. Susie and Stacy had cars in the driveway there, while Cheryl's was in the carport. When they approached the door, the couple found a broken light globe by the front door. That was the only sign of anything amiss in the whole thing. Janelle, ready for the water park, was not wearing shoes, so her boyfriend cleaned up the glass so Janelle wouldn't cut herself. They entered the house, but no one was home. Oddly, they found all 3 women's purses lined up on the floor inside Susie's room. They were about to leave when the phone rang. Believing it may have been Stacy, Janelle went ahead and answered the phone. The caller, a male whose voice Janelle did not recognize, made obscene remarks to her, and so she hung up the phone. Later, she would regret that she did not stay on the phone long enough for the phone company to be able to trace it back after the fact. They did not have the technology back then to do that. Meanwhile, Stacy's mother is becoming concerned. Her daughter was supposed to call her before they left for the water park, and she has not heard from Stacy. After no luck making phone calls, she also drove to the Levitt house. Janelle, making another attempt to find the girls, returned as well, so they got there at the same time. And Stacy's mother knew something was wrong when she saw the purses on the floor, and she also saw that Stacy's clothes were folded neatly on the dresser, and those were the only clothes that Stacy had with her. So she would not have walked out of the house to go anywhere not dressed. And the other thing that tipped her off was in Cheryl's purse. She had money, but she also had her cigarettes. And Cheryl was a chain smoker, and so that was particularly concerning to Stacy's mom because she knew she wouldn't be able to go that long without a cigarette. And so Stacy's mom called her husband, and she called the police. By the time the first police officer arrived, several people had been in and out of the house, which made it difficult for the detectives and forensics to process the scene. It appeared the 3 had simply vanished, leaving behind every last one of their possessions. Their purses, their cars, everything still at the house. No signs of a struggle anywhere. The police theorized they must have been forced to leave the house, but they weren't sure how or why. The police looked into Cheryl's life to see if there may have been someone who wanted to hurt the older woman. Cheryl was recently divorced from Susie's stepfather, but that didn't seem to be an issue. Cheryl was enjoying her independence and focusing on Susie. Police zeroed in on Bart Streeter, Cheryl's son and Susie's older brother by 9 years. Bart had been violent with his mother in the past, and Susie also was afraid he would hurt her. He had struggled with alcohol abuse since he left his mother's house at the age of 17. Cheryl had disowned him and didn't want him near her house, so he had moved out of state for several years. He had broken up with a girlfriend, so he'd recently moved back to Springfield, and he tried to start a relationship with his mother and sister again. Susie was excited, and Cheryl was skeptical. During her senior year, when she turned 18, she moved in with Bart against her mother's wishes, and she was all excited about that. But then one day, Bart was drunk. He was playing his music too loud, and she went in and told him to turn it down, reached behind him to try to turn down the stereo. He turned around and punched her in the face. So that was the end of that. She moved home, didn't talk to him again. And so on the night of the disappearance, Bart was drinking and watching TV at a neighbor's house. The neighbor confirmed that and said Bart was, quote, sloshed. Bart went home around 11:30 and said he fell asleep. He took a polygraph and passed. Then they launched searches. Lake Springfield was dragged. They used police dogs, helicopters, but they didn't uncover anything. Several weeks into the investigation, they identified two suspects. Dustin Racklin was Susie's ex-boyfriend. Dustin and Michael Clay were involved in a mausoleum break-in and stole teeth out of corpses.
Oh, Lord.
He had borrowed Susie's car and used it in the crime. When Susie was contacted by the police, she told the police who had borrowed her car, and Susie was scheduled to testify against them. Police took their fingerprints and compared them to those found in the house, but none matched. They also passed polygraphs. Police got a tip. Robert Cox had been convicted of kidnapping and assault with a deadly weapon. He was a prime suspect in the 1976 murder of an Orlando teenager who was abducted on her way home from work. Cox was in town with his parents on a trip to Disney World, of all things. He returned to the motel on the night in question with a severely lacerated tongue, like someone had bit his tongue very hard, and he was taken to the hospital. The girl's corpse was found near the hotel room. He was released because of insufficient evidence. He worked for a telephone company at the time of the Springfield 3 disappearance, and he was surveying the underground wiring that was in front of Cheryl's house. Before that, in a strange coincidence, he was employed at the same car dealership as Stacy's father. Although Stacy's father, Stuart McCall, did not have interactions with Cox, Cox would have seen Stacy occasionally bringing him dinner at the dealership. But Cox seemed to have an alibi. He went to a golf tournament and spent the night out of town at his parents' house. Then he took his girlfriend to church the next morning, and his girlfriend confirmed this. Years later, Cox was arrested in Texas for holding a gun on a 12-year-old girl. He's a really swell guy. He came back on the police's radar, and investigators were sent to interview him again. This time he didn't talk. So police interviewed his now ex-girlfriend, and she admitted she had no idea where he was on the night in question, and they did not go to church the next day. In 1996, when a TV reporter interviewed him in prison, he broke his silence and said, "I know that they're dead, I'll say that much." After 5 years, the police announced they can no longer have the resources to continue working the case. It's still classified as open. No one has been ruled out as a person of interest. None of those people I mentioned have been ruled out, and the police will still follow up on any tips as they occasionally come in. Cox said he would tell everybody what had happened when his mother died because he didn't want to embarrass his mother, evidently, but she has died. He still has said nothing. He's still in